Tonight, you check on your kids one more time before you go to bed. You crack the door, you listen for breathing, you close it again, satisfied, and you go to bed believing that's the last check you'll need to make. For one father in Shelby, North Carolina, it was. At around 2:30 in the morning on February 14th, 2000, Harold Degree looked in on his 9-year-old daughter and her older brother. Both children were asleep. Everything was ordinary. Nothing about that room gave any warning of what was coming. By 6:15 that morning, his wife Akila went to wake the kids for school. Asha was gone. Her book bag was gone. There's no broken window, no forced door, no sign that anyone had come in from the outside. A 9-year-old girl had simply left her own bed in the middle of the night in a rainstorm and walked out into the dark. Where do you even start with that? You start with the evidence actually shows, because in this case, almost nothing about it fits the shape you'd expect. Shelby is a small town. Everyone there will tell you they know everybody. Asher was a 4th grader, quiet, well-liked, the kind of kid neighbors describe as sweet without hesitating. That's not a detail added for effect. It's the reason the case became known across Cleveland County simply as Shelby's sweetheart. Investigators pieced together a 4-hour window, somewhere between 2:30 and 6:30 a.m. Asher left her house on her own, carrying a book bag she had apparently packed by herself. Search dogs picked up no trail worth following. There was light rain that night, heavy enough to explain why scent evidence didn't hold. But there's something else the rain can't explain. Why would a 9-year-old pack a bag in secret and walk out into a storm in the middle of the night? That question sat unanswered for over an hour before anyone even realized she was missing. Several drivers on Highway 18 reported seeing a young girl walking alone that morning, headed away from her home toward town. One driver said that when he slowed his car to check on her, she didn't wave him down. She didn't ask for help. She ran straight off the road and into the tree line, disappearing into the woods before he could reach her. Think about that reaction for a second. A child, alone, at 4 in the morning in a storm, and when a car finally stops near her, she runs from it. That single detail is the hinge the entire case turns on. It doesn't fit a simple story. It doesn't fit she was taken from her bed. It doesn't fit she ran away on a whim. Either forensic psychologists who studied child behavior under stress will tell you that flight from a potential helper usually signals one of two things. The child has been taught, very deliberately, not to trust a stranger's car, or the child is already terrified of being found, for reasons that have nothing to do with the driver at all. Nobody knows which one applies here. That's what makes it unbearable. The search that followed was one of the largest in North Carolina in history. Volunteers walked the ditches along Highway 18 for miles. Cadaver dogs were brought in early, a detail investigators don't take lightly because it meant from day one professionals were already preparing for the worst outcome while still hoping for the best one. For a year and a half, there was nothing. No sightings that held up. No body, no bag, just a billboard erected along the highway at exactly the spot where Asher ran into the trees, so that anyone driving past would have to see her face and remember. Then, in August of 2001, a construction crew working off of Highway 18 in Burke County, more than 25 miles from the Degree home, uncovered a book bag wrapped inside 2 sealed black garbage bags buried in the dirt. It was hers. Sit with that distance for a moment. 25 miles. Buried, wrapped. Not lost, not dropped, not left behind in a hurry. Concealed. That word, concealed, is the word investigators use today, and it changes everything about how you have to read this case. A backpack doesn't wrap itself in plastic and bury itself in the ground. Someone did that. Someone who needed it gone, and gone carefully. For years after the backpack was found, the case went cold in ways these cases often do. Detectives on it change. Technology changes. What didn't change was the family. Akila Degree gave interview after interview, decade after decade, saying the same thing every time. She believed her daughter was still alive. She said in her own words that she wasn't foolish enough to think a 9-year-old could vanish without somebody, somewhere, knowing something. She was right that somebody knew something. It just took her over 20 years to reach it. Along the way, the case moved through nearly every stage of a modern missing child investigation. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, a unit built specifically for cases like this one, spent more than a week in Shelby retracing the same 4-hour window investigators had been staring at for years. Working with the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, the Bureau released a series of age-progressed images of Asha over time, showing what she might look like as a teenager, then as a young woman in her 20s, then as a woman approaching 30. Each new image did the same thing. It reminded the public that somewhere out there, if she were alive, she would no longer look anything like the 9-year-old on the billboard. In 2018, detectives released 2 more physical clues recovered from the backpack that had never been publicly shown before: a folded band t-shirt and a small paperback book, neither of which matched anything her family recognized as hers. Local investigator Tim Adams, who worked the case for years at the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office, said publicly that the items simply did not belong to Asha, which meant something else had touched that bag at some point before it was wrapped and buried. In 2016, investigators released another new detail: an older dark green vehicle seen near the area twice on the morning Asha disappeared. It became one of the case's defining images: a car nobody could place, tied to a girl nobody could find, a year later. The FBI staged a full recreation of that early morning, walking the highway at the same hour in the same weather conditions, trying to see what a driver would have seen, trying to understand how a 9-year-old on foot could vanish so completely along a road other cars were using at the same time. Then, in September of 2024, everything moved at once. The FBI, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, and the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office executed search warrants across multiple properties in the county: homes, an assisted living facility, and a property in Charlotte. According to court documents made public afterward, DNA evidence recovered from inside Asha's backpack, including a hair found on her undershirt, had been matched to members of her local family. One of those matches belonged to a woman who was 13 years old in February of 2000. 2 of her sisters were 15 and 16 at the time. Read that again. The DNA didn't point to strangers passing through town. It pointed to teenagers from a family already living in the same county, the same rural stretch of a highway Asha walked that night. A second name surfaced in the same documents: a man who had lived in facilities operated by that same family who had died years earlier in 2004. Before any of the evidence came to light, investigators found his DNA connected to the case as well. By February of 2025, more warrants followed. Investigators seized cell phones not from strangers, but from a local man and 2 of his adult daughters. Text messages recovered from an earlier search reportedly became a part of a case file, and separately, someone came forward describing a night years earlier at a party when one of those daughters broke down, sobbing, and said she had killed Asha Degree. Investigators have now said outright in court filings what they avoided saying for almost a quarter of a century. They believe Asha Degree was the victim of a homicide, and that her body had been deliberately concealed because the police investigators believed were involved were a 15 and a 16 years old at the time. Detectives had said in public statements that adult help would likely have been necessary to carry it out and hide it afterwards. That detail matters more than it first sounds like it should. Victimologists who study cases involving juvenile offenders point out that concealment on this case, sustained across decades, almost never survive on a teenager's planning alone. A body or evidence connected to one has to stay hidden through decades of construction, new owners, new technology, and new search techniques. That kind of durability usually requires someone older, someone with property, someone with the standing in a small community to make sure certain questions never got asked out loud. It's the one reason investigators have spent so much time in the last 2 years focused not on the teenager named in their earliest DNA matches, but on the adults around them. A 9-year-old girl, 2 or 3 teenagers barely enough to drive, and investigators suspect at least one adult who made sure it stayed buried for 25 years. None of it explains the part that started this. Why did Asha pack a bag and walk out into a storm in the middle of the night, on her own, before any of that ever happened to her? The detail sits outside the DNA, outside the warrants, outside everything investigators have pieced together since. It's the part of the story that came from inside her own house, and it may be the part no test can ever answer. Her family is still in that house, in Shelby, decades later. Her mother still says she believes her daughter could be alive even now, even with everything the courts have made public. Maybe that's a mother's grief, refusing an ending. Or maybe it's the same instinct that made her say all those years ago that a child cannot vanish without someone knowing something. She may write about that part. It just took a generation to prove it. Tonight, you check on your kids one more time before you go to sleep. You'll crack the door, you'll listen for breathing, you'll close it again, satisfied, and go to bed believing that's the last check you'll need to make. For one family in Shelby, it wasn't, and 25 years later, they're still finding out exactly how far that night really went.